Imagine standing in the desert before sunrise. The world is silent. The sand is cold beneath your feet. Behind you lies Egypt, the most powerful empire on earth. Ahead of you lies wilderness. No city, no army, no food supply, no visible future. Around you are families carrying everything they own. Children are crying. Old men are leaning on staffs. Women are holding infants close to their chest. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of chariot wheels begins to rise. According to the Bible, this was the moment when an enslaved people stepped out of the shadow of Pharaoh and into one of the most mysterious journeys in human history, the Exodus. For billions of people, it is not just an ancient story. It is the story of deliverance, the story of God breaking the power of empire, the story of a people born in suffering, rescued through miracles, and led toward a promised land. But for historians and archaeologists, the Exodus raises a question that has never fully gone away. Did it really happen? If hundreds of thousands of people left Egypt, why is the archaeological evidence so difficult to find? Why do Egyptian records not clearly describe the loss of an entire slave population? Why has the route of the Exodus remained so debated? And why does one of the most important events in the Bible leave behind such a complicated trail? Tonight, we are not going to mock faith, and we are not going to force history to say more than it can say. We are going to walk carefully. We will look at the biblical account. We will look at Egypt. We will look at the silence of the desert. And we will ask one question. What if the Exodus is not simple because history itself is not simple? To understand the mystery, we must first return to Egypt. Not the Egypt of imagination, not the Egypt of movies, but the Egypt of power, stone, temples, soldiers, gods, and kings. More than 3,000 years ago, Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. The Nile River gave it life. Each year, the river flooded and left behind rich black soil. That soil produced grain. Grain created wealth. Wealth created cities. Cities created armies. And armies protected the throne of Pharaoh. To the people of Egypt, Pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He stood between heaven and earth. He was connected to the gods. His words shaped law. His image filled temples. His name was carved into stone so that it might never be forgotten. Egypt did not think of itself as fragile. Egypt thought of itself as eternal. That is why the biblical story is so powerful. Because the book of Exodus does not begin with a great army rising against Egypt. It begins with slaves. It begins with fear. It begins with a small people who had no king, no land, no weapons, and no political power. According to the Bible, the Israelites had once entered Egypt during a famine. Their ancestor Joseph had risen to power under Pharaoh. Because of Joseph, his family was allowed to settle in Egypt. For a time, they lived in peace. But generations passed. Joseph died. The Pharaoh who remembered him died. And then the Bible gives one of the most chilling lines in the entire story. A new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. With that one sentence, everything changes. The Israelites are no longer remembered as guests. They are seen as a threat. They have grown numerous. They are different. They live inside Egypt, but they are not fully Egyptian. Pharaoh fears that if war comes, they might join Egypt's enemies. So he makes a decision that will define the rest of the story. He enslaves them. The Bible says the Israelites were forced into hard labor. They built store cities. They worked under harsh taskmasters. Their lives became bitter with brick, mortar, and field labor. And then Pharaoh goes even further. He orders Hebrew baby boys to be killed. It is in this world of fear that Moses is born. a child hidden by his mother, placed in a basket, set among the reeds of the Nile, found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised inside the very palace that wanted him dead. This is the first great irony of Exodus. The deliverer of Israel grows up in the house of the oppressor. Moses knows Egypt from the inside. He knows its language. He knows its customs. He knows its power. But he also knows that he is not fully one of them. One day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Something inside him breaks. He kills the Egyptian and hides the body, but the act is discovered. Moses flees Egypt. The prince becomes a fugitive. The man raised in palaces disappears into the wilderness. For years, nothing seems to happen. Moses becomes a shepherd. He marries. He builds a quiet life far from Pharaoh. The story could have ended there. A man with a hidden past, living out his days in exile. But according to Exodus, God had not forgotten the cries of the enslaved. And one day, Moses sees a bush burning in the wilderness. But the bush is not consumed. From the fire, God calls his name, Moses, Moses. And everything changes again. God tells Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. Not with an army, not with a rebellion, not with political strategy, but with a command. Let my people go. This is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes a collision between two visions of power. Pharaoh represents empire, control, forced labor, the gods of Egypt. The belief that one man can own the future of an entire people. Moses represents something completely different. A God who hears slaves. A God who sees suffering. A God who does not need temples or armies to act. When Moses returns to Egypt, Pharaoh refuses. His answer is not simply political. It is theological. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? That question stands at the heart of the Exodus, because the plagues are not random disasters. They are presented as a direct challenge to Pharaoh's world. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs cover the land. Dust becomes gnats. Flies invade homes. Livestock die. Boils break out. Hail destroys crops. Locusts devour what remains. Darkness falls over Egypt. And finally, the most terrible plague comes. The death of the firstborn. To modern ears, the plagues are difficult, frightening, and morally heavy. But inside the biblical story, they are the collapse of Egypt's confidence. The Nile, source of life, becomes death. The sky, the land, the animals, the crops all fall beyond Pharaoh's control. The king who claimed divine power cannot protect his own house. Only after the final plague does Pharaoh allow the Israelites to leave. The Bible says they depart in haste. Bread has no time to rise. Families gather what they can. The night becomes a doorway. Slavery is behind them. Freedom is ahead. But the story does not allow freedom to arrive easily. Soon Pharaoh changes his mind. He gathers his chariots. Egypt pursues. The Israelites reach the sea. They are trapped. Water in front. Army behind. Panic spreads through the camp. Moses says one of the most famous lines in the story. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord. Then, according to the Bible, the waters divide. A path opens through the sea. The Israelites cross on dry ground. The Egyptians follow. The waters return. And the army of Pharaoh is swallowed. This is the cinematic center of the Exodus. The image everyone remembers. The sea split in two. The slaves walking between walls of water. The empire collapsing behind them. But when the waters close, the mystery opens. Because now we must ask the historical question. Where did this happen? When did this happen? And what evidence would such an event leave behind? Here is where the investigation becomes difficult. The Bible gives us a powerful story, but archaeology does not give us a simple answer. There is no Egyptian inscription saying, "Pharaoh lost his slaves to Moses." There is no battlefield marker at the sea. There is no universally agreed route through the wilderness. There is no single artifact that says, "This proves the Exodus happened exactly as described." For some, that silence is enough to reject the story. But silence in ancient history is not always simple. Egyptian royal inscriptions were not neutral newspapers. They were propaganda. They celebrated victories. They magnified Pharaoh. They carved success into stone. They did not usually preserve humiliating defeats for future generations. If Pharaoh lost slaves, suffered plagues, and watched an army destroyed, would Egypt have recorded it honestly? Maybe not. But that does not automatically prove the Exodus happened. It only means the silence of Egypt must be handled carefully. The desert adds another problem. Nomadic people do not always leave clear traces. A settled city leaves walls, pottery layers, tombs, temples, and foundations. A moving population leaves much less. Campfires vanish. Cloth decays. Wood breaks down. Bones scatter. And after thousands of years of wind, sand, erosion, and human movement, even real traces can become almost invisible. Still, the scale described in the Bible creates a major challenge. If the Exodus involved an enormous population wandering for 40 years, many scholars argue we would expect stronger archaeological evidence in the Sinai. That evidence has not appeared in a way that convinces the academic world. This is why some researchers suggest a different possibility. Perhaps the Exodus happened, but on a smaller scale. Perhaps a group of Semitic slaves or laborers escaped Egypt. Perhaps their story was preserved, retold, expanded, and eventually became the national origin story of Israel. In this view, the Exodus is not pure fiction. But it may not be a modern-style documentary record either. It may be a sacred memory. A historical core wrapped in theology, identity, and generations of retelling. To many believers, that idea feels uncomfortable, because the Exodus is central to faith. It is remembered in Passover. It echoes through the prophets. It shapes the New Testament. It becomes a pattern of salvation itself. But history and faith often ask different questions. Faith asks, what does this reveal about God? History asks, what can be verified from surviving evidence? The problem is that ancient evidence is always incomplete. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the debate about Pharaoh. The Bible does not name the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That omission has created centuries of debate. Some point to Ramesses II because Exodus mentions the Israelites building a city called Ramesses. Ramesses II was one of Egypt's greatest builders. His reign was long. His monuments were everywhere. His name was powerful. The idea feels natural. A proud pharaoh. A massive building program. Hebrew labor. Moses confronting the throne. It fits the imagination perfectly. But other scholars prefer an earlier date. They point to biblical chronology that seems to place the Exodus centuries before Ramesses II. If that is correct, then another pharaoh must be considered. This creates one of the great puzzles. Should we follow the name Ramesses or the biblical chronology? Should we place Exodus in the 13th century BCE or earlier in the 15th century BCE? There is no universal agreement, and each date creates its own problems. A late date seems to connect better with the world of Ramesses and Egyptian power in the eastern delta, but it compresses the timeline before Israel appears in Canaan. An early date may fit certain biblical numbers better, but it struggles with other archaeological and historical details. Then comes the Merneptah Stele. This Egyptian inscription, dated near the end of the 13th century BCE, mentions Israel and Canaan. That matters, because by that time, some group called Israel was already known to Egypt. Not necessarily a kingdom, not necessarily a powerful state, but a people, a recognizable group. This does not prove the Exodus, but it does set a boundary. If Israel was already in Canaan by the late 13th century BCE, then any Exodus tradition must be understood before or around that larger historical horizon. The stele gives us a shadow, not the whole story, just a shadow. And sometimes in ancient history, shadows are all we get. There are other possible clues. Egyptian records mention groups of Semitic people living, working, and moving in and out of Egypt at different times. This is important because it shows that the biblical picture of people from Canaan entering Egypt is not impossible. The eastern Nile Delta was a place of contact. People moved because of famine, trade, labor, war, and survival. Egypt needed workers. Egypt used forced labor. Egypt controlled parts of Canaan. So the basic setting of the Exodus story is not absurd. A Semitic population in Egypt. Possible. Forced labor. Historically plausible. Movement between Canaan and Egypt. Well attested in the broader world. A memory of escape. Not impossible. But the exact biblical scale. That is where the debate intensifies. This is why the Exodus mystery does not have a simple yes or no answer. The question is not only, did it happen? The deeper question is, what kind of event are we looking for? Are we looking for a mass migration of hundreds of thousands? Are we looking for a smaller escape group? Are we looking for a memory of Egyptian oppression preserved by early Israel? Are we looking for a theological story built from real historical fragments? Or are we looking at something even more complex, a story where memory, miracle, trauma, and national identity became inseparable? Consider what the Exodus meant to ancient Israel. It told them who they were. They were not born from empire. They were rescued from empire. They were not chosen because they were strong. They were chosen while they were weak. Their God was not the God of Pharaoh. Their God heard the cry of slaves. That message is so powerful that it survived exile, conquest, destruction, and centuries of retelling. Even when Israel later lost its land, its temple, and its kings, the Exodus remained. Why? Because the Exodus was more than an event. It was an identity. Every generation could look back and say, we were slaves. We were delivered. We were led through the sea. We were brought into covenant. And this is where the mystery becomes human. Because human beings remember suffering differently than they remember ordinary days. Trauma burns itself into memory. Stories of survival become sacred. A family escape can become a tribal memory. A tribal memory can become a national story. A national story can become scripture. That does not mean it is false. It means it has become larger than a single layer of history. The Exodus is like an ancient flame seen through thick glass. You can see the light. You can feel the heat. But the exact shape of the fire is hard to recover. So what can we honestly say? We can say that the biblical Exodus is one of the most influential stories ever told. We can say that ancient Egypt was a real setting of power, forced labor, and imperial control. We can say that Semitic peoples did live and work in Egypt across different periods. We can say that the name Israel appears outside the Bible by the late 13th century BCE. We can say that archaeology has not confirmed a massive exodus exactly as described in the Bible. We can also say that archaeology has not erased every possible historical core behind the story. The evidence does not give us a clean courtroom verdict. It gives us fragments, a text, a memory, a desert, a stele, a vanished route, a people who remembered Egypt not as a place of glory, but as a house of bondage. And maybe that is why the Exodus continues to haunt the imagination, because the story stands at the border between history and faith. If you look only for inscriptions, you may miss the memory. If you look only for miracles, you may ignore the questions. But if you stand between both worlds, something fascinating appears. The Exodus may not be easy to prove, but it is impossible to ignore. It shaped Judaism. It shaped Christianity. It influenced ideas of freedom, liberation, covenant, justice, and hope. Enslaved communities throughout history have seen themselves in this story. Oppressed people have heard in Moses the voice of resistance. The words, "Let my people go," have echoed far beyond ancient Egypt. And perhaps that is the deepest reason the Exodus survived. Not because every detail is easy, not because every question has been answered, but because it speaks to something universal: the cry to be free, the longing for deliverance, the belief that empire does not have the final word, the hope that somewhere beyond fear there is a road through the sea. So, did the Exodus really happen? The most honest answer is this: something powerful stands behind this story. Maybe a great national escape. Maybe a smaller historical event remembered through sacred tradition. Maybe a deep collective memory of oppression and deliverance. Maybe a mystery that still refuses to be reduced to simple categories. But one thing is certain. More than 3,000 years later, we are still asking the question. We are still searching the desert. We are still looking at Egypt's stones. We are still reading the ancient text. And we are still standing, in our imagination, at the edge of the sea, waiting to see whether the waters will open. Because the Exodus is not only a story about what happened long ago. It is a story about every moment in history when the powerless stand before the impossible and dare to believe that freedom is still ahead.